Sometimes the most important secret you will ever protect is one you were never supposed to see. At exactly 8:50 on a rainy Tuesday morning, Whitmore Technologies stood only 10 minutes away from unveiling the cybersecurity platform that financial analysts had already called the company's most valuable innovation in a decade. Hundreds of employees hurried through polished glass hallways while executives rehearsed presentations inside a conference auditorium overlooking downtown Seattle. Reporters were already gathering in the lobby. Investors from New York, Chicago, Dallas, and San Francisco filled the front rows. Then every monitor across the building suddenly turned black. The giant digital clock above the operations center continued counting down while frightened voices echoed across the room. "We're locked out. Nothing is responding. The backup servers are offline. Who authorized this update?" Every sentence arrived faster than the one before it, but no answer followed. Claire Whitmore, the 36-year-old billionaire founder and CEO of Whitmore Technologies, stepped into the command center wearing an ivory business suit that reflected the cold blue light of dozens of frozen computer screens. She had spent 15 years building her company from a rented office into one of America's fastest-growing technology firms. Yet in that moment, she could only watch as millions of dollars and countless reputations seemed ready to disappear before a single presentation even began. Her chief technology officer insisted his team needed more time. Another executive suggested delaying the launch. Claire looked at the countdown clock again. 9 minutes remained. "Call the outside specialist," she said without raising her voice. Several people exchanged uncertain looks. The specialist who arrived less than 5 minutes later hardly resembled the legendary systems architect described in old industry articles. Daniel Brooks walked through the security doors carrying a worn laptop bag and a compact toolbox that had clearly seen years of honest work. His navy button-down shirt was neatly pressed, though its sleeves showed signs of frequent repairs. Rainwater still glistened on his jacket as he quietly greeted the receptionist before entering the operations center. Some executives looked disappointed the moment they saw him. Others barely noticed him at all. The chief technology officer folded his arms. "He's our emergency backup?" Daniel simply nodded and placed his laptop beside the primary workstation without responding to the remark. His eyes moved calmly across the dark monitors, blinking server indicators and network diagrams that covered the walls. The room remained loud, but Daniel seemed to hear something entirely different beneath the noise. His fingers moved across the keyboard with patient precision as diagnostic windows appeared one after another. Within moments, he bypassed the frozen interface and accessed a protected recovery environment that no one else in the room had managed to reach. Hidden folders slowly appeared across the screen as encrypted files were restored one by one. Then a single image unexpectedly opened before him. It was an old photograph of Claire, years younger, smiling with the uncertain hope of someone who had not yet learned to hide behind confidence. Beneath the photograph appeared 6 simple words. "Do you think I am pretty?" Daniel's expression changed only for an instant. Without reading another file or opening another folder, he immediately reached for the close button. Before his finger touched the mouse, the office door opened behind him. Claire stopped in silence. Her eyes moved from Daniel to the photograph glowing softly on the monitor. The countdown clock continued ticking above them. 8 minutes remained. "Step away from my computer," she said quietly, her voice carrying far more disappointment than anger. Daniel slowly stood, taking one step backward without offering an excuse. Around them, the room became strangely silent. No one noticed that while everyone had been watching the photograph, Daniel had already recognized something far more dangerous. The system had not failed by accident. Daniel kept both hands visible as he stepped away from the workstation without the slightest sign of resentment. "I did not open it on purpose," he said quietly. "The recovery folder. Restored automatically. I closed it the moment I realized it was personal." Claire did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the monitor for another second before she reached forward and closed the image herself. The operations center was silent except for the low hum of emergency backup systems struggling to stay online. Marcus Hale, finally broke the silence with a skeptical smile. That explanation sounds convenient. Daniel turned toward him calmly. You do not have to believe me. The system logs will tell you exactly how long that file remained open. Marcus folded his arms. Right now we do not have time to analyze logs. Daniel nodded. Then we should focus on what is stopping your network. Claire looked from Marcus to Daniel, searching both faces for something she could trust. Can you restore the platform before the presentation? She asked. Daniel glanced at the countdown clock. Less than 7 minutes remained. Yes, he answered without hesitation. But only if everyone stops guessing and lets me work. The confidence in his voice did not sound proud. It sounded practiced, like someone who had learned that panic only made difficult problems harder. One by one, the engineers stepped back from the primary console. Daniel reopened the recovery environment, this time ignoring every restored document and moving directly into the authentication records. His eyes narrowed slightly as lines of encrypted activity scrolled across the display. Someone had initiated an internal administrative command several minutes before the system collapsed, but the digital signature did not match the account that supposedly issued it. Daniel quietly copied several timestamps onto a notepad before continuing. He said nothing. Solving the emergency came first. Explanations could wait. The room held its breath as he rebuilt the authentication sequence, restored corrupted security certificates, and redirected traffic through an isolated backup environment. One monitor came back to life. Then another. Within seconds, dozens of dark screens lit up across the operations center. Green status indicators slowly replaced the sea of red warnings that had covered every dashboard only moments earlier. Conversations returned. Phones began ringing again. Someone near the back whispered, "We are online." Another engineer verified that the demonstration servers were responding normally. Relief spread through the room almost as quickly as the panic had arrived. Claire looked at the restored system, then back at Daniel, but before she could speak, his phone vibrated in his pocket. The ringtone was soft, almost lost beneath the sound of keyboards. Daniel excused himself with a polite nod before answering. His voice changed immediately, becoming warmer without losing its calm rhythm. "Yes, sweetheart, I remember. I will be there." He listened for a few seconds before smiling gently. "No, I'm not going to miss your science presentation. I promised you, and promises matter." Claire could hear the excitement in the little girl's voice, even though she could not make out the words. Daniel glanced toward the large clock on the wall and calculated the drive across Seattle in his head. "I have enough time," he assured his daughter. "I will leave as soon as I finish here." When the call ended, he placed the phone back into his pocket with the same care he had shown every piece of equipment inside the room. Marcus gave a quiet laugh. "You are leaving after this? We may need you again." Daniel looked at him without irritation. "My daughter has been practicing for weeks. She only gets one chance to present today." Claire studied him in silence. Minutes earlier, she had seen only a stranger standing in front of her computer. Now she saw a father measuring success very differently from everyone else in the room. As Daniel packed away his tools, Claire glanced once more at the recovery log still open on the monitor. A single detail caught her attention. The photograph had remained open for less than 2 seconds before Daniel had attempted to close it. Suddenly, she was no longer certain that her first judgment had been correct. Claire remained in her office long after the presentation ended successfully. The applause from investors had faded. Reporters had left the building, and the executive floor had slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Yet one question refused to leave her mind. Why would a man who had every opportunity to misuse a private moment choose to look away instead? She opened Daniel Brooks's contractor profile, expecting to find an ordinary freelance technician with a few years of experience. Instead, she found almost nothing. His recent work history consisted of small repair contracts for schools, neighborhood businesses, libraries, and nonprofit organizations across the Seattle area. Curious, she requested archived professional records from her human resources department. Within minutes, an older employment history appeared on her screen, and for the first time that day, she leaned back in genuine surprise. Years earlier, Daniel had been one of the lead systems architects behind a cybersecurity platform that had quietly influenced financial institutions across the country. His published research had once been discussed at technology conferences from Boston to San Diego. Then, almost overnight, his professional record simply stopped. No scandals, no lawsuits, no corporate failure. He had disappeared from an industry that rarely allowed talented people to walk away voluntarily. Claire continued reading until a brief public obituary answered the question every resume had ignored. Daniel's wife, Rebecca Brooks, had passed away after a sudden illness nearly 8 years earlier. Several months later, he resigned from his executive position and never returned to corporate leadership. Claire closed the file slowly, realizing she had spent years surrounded by people who chased larger offices, while one of the most gifted engineers she had ever encountered had quietly chosen parenthood over prestige. Across town, Daniel pulled into the parking lot of Emma's elementary school, just as students began leaving the building. Emma spotted his familiar pickup truck immediately and ran toward him with a wide smile, carefully carrying a colorful display board covered with drawings of planets and handwritten science notes. "You came," she said with obvious relief. Daniel smiled warmly. "I told you I would." Emma slipped her small hand into his as they walked toward the school cafeteria where families had gathered for the afternoon science fair. She proudly explained her model of the solar system, while Daniel listened as though every word were the most important presentation he would hear all year. He asked thoughtful questions, admired every detail, and applauded just as enthusiastically as if she had won a national competition. Afterward, they stopped by the school computer lab, where several aging desktop computers sat stacked against one wall, waiting for repairs the district could not afford. Daniel quietly unpacked his toolkit, while Emma organized cables beside him with practiced confidence. Together, they replaced damaged memory modules, cleaned dusty cooling fans, and restarted machines that had been unusable for months. A teacher thanked Daniel and apologized for not having enough money to pay him properly. He simply smiled. If these computers help children learn, that is payment enough. Emma looked up proudly at her father because she had heard him say those words before. As the late afternoon sunlight filled the classroom windows with a warm golden glow, Claire found herself opening Daniel's profile once more instead of preparing for her next board meeting. Success had introduced her to brilliant people, ambitious people, and powerful people, but she could not remember the last time she had met someone whose greatest achievement seemed to be keeping a promise to a little girl. Then another detail from the recovery logs caught her attention. The unauthorized administrative command Daniel had quietly copied onto his notepad had never been mentioned in the official incident report. The following Monday morning, a brief email arrived in Daniel Brooks's inbox with a subject line so ordinary that it almost escaped his attention. Whitmore Technologies requested a follow-up inspection to verify the long-term stability of the network after the previous emergency. Daniel accepted the appointment without hesitation, loaded his familiar toolkit into the back of his pickup truck, and drove through downtown Seattle beneath a sky filled with slow-moving gray clouds. He expected another routine service visit and nothing more. Inside the headquarters, Claire Whitmore watched from her office window as Daniel crossed the plaza with the same unhurried confidence she remembered from the operations center. He did not look around to admire the impressive building. He did not appear intimidated by the luxury surrounding him. He simply walked toward the entrance as though every workplace deserved the same respect regardless of its size. Marcus Hale noticed Claire watching and stepped quietly beside her. "You called him back rather quickly," he remarked. Claire answered without taking her eyes from the entrance. "The network deserves a complete review." Marcus smiled politely, although disappointment briefly crossed his face. "Our internal team is fully capable." Claire turned toward him. Then they should welcome another professional opinion. A few minutes later, Daniel entered the server room where engineers had already gathered. He greeted everyone with a simple good morning before connecting his diagnostic equipment. The room remained comfortably cool, filled with the steady sound of cooling fans and blinking network indicators. Daniel reviewed the authentication records once again and quietly compared them with the notes he had copied during the emergency. After several minutes, he pointed toward a small inconsistency buried deep inside the administrative permissions. "This configuration should not exist," he said calmly. One engineer frowned. "It has been there for months." Daniel gently shook his head. "No, the timestamp says it appeared 3 days ago. Someone created a secondary authorization path that bypasses your normal approval process." Marcus quickly stepped forward. "Could it simply be a software update?" Daniel looked at the screen again before answering. "Software updates leave manufacturer signatures. This one does not." The room grew noticeably quieter. Claire watched Daniel explain the issue without accusing anyone or trying to impress the engineers surrounding him. He spoke with patience instead of superiority, answering every question with careful detail until even the youngest technician understood the problem. When the review concluded, Claire asked whether he had time for coffee before leaving. Daniel hesitated only long enough to check the clock. "I can stay for 30 minutes, he replied. "Emma finishes music club at 4 o'clock. They walked to a quiet cafe across the street where the afternoon crowd had not yet arrived. Fresh coffee filled the air while soft jazz played through hidden speakers. Claire wrapped both hands around a warm ceramic cup before finally asking the question that had remained with her since the previous week. "Why did you never tell anyone about the photograph?" Daniel stirred his coffee once before answering. "Because it was never my story to tell." Claire studied his face, searching for any sign of performance, but found only quiet sincerity. Most people would have defended themselves. Daniel smiled gently. "Trust is rarely destroyed by one terrible decision. Usually it disappears because of small choices people make when they believe nobody is watching." Claire lowered her eyes, silently remembering how quickly she had judged him. Before she could respond, Daniel's phone displayed a new message from Emma. She had attached a smiling picture of the ribbon she earned during music club along with 3 simple words that made him smile without thinking. "I kept practicing." Claire noticed the expression on his face and realized that despite every achievement she had collected over the years, she could not remember the last message that had brought her that kind of uncomplicated joy. Neither of them noticed Marcus watching quietly from the opposite side of the street before turning away, with a plan already beginning to take shape. The following afternoon, Daniel arrived at the neighborhood coffee shop a few minutes earlier than expected, choosing a quiet table beside the large front windows where gentle sunlight reflected across polished wooden floors. Claire entered shortly afterward without the formal confidence she carried inside corporate boardrooms. She wore a simple cream sweater beneath a light gray coat instead of her usual executive wardrobe. And for the first time, Daniel saw someone who looked less like the head of a billion-dollar company and more like an ordinary woman hoping for an honest conversation. "Thank you for coming," Claire said as she sat down. Daniel smiled politely. "You already thanked me once." Claire looked down at her coffee before answering. "I did not think I thanked you for the right thing." Their conversation moved naturally from technology to family, then from family to the choices people make when life changes without permission. Daniel spoke about raising Emma alone, never dramatizing the difficult years or asking for sympathy. He described learning how to braid hair from online videos, burning more pancakes than he cared to admit, attending every parent-teacher conference, and discovering that success looked different after becoming father. Claire listened more than she spoke. She had negotiated international business deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet she found herself paying closer attention to stories about school lunches, science projects, and bedtime promises than to any financial report she had ever reviewed. Halfway through their conversation, Daniel glanced toward the entrance and smiled. Emma walked through the door holding a colorful paper gift bag, almost as large as her backpack. Her after-school art class had ended early, and Daniel's neighbor had kindly dropped her off at the cafe. Emma hurried over with bright eyes full of excitement. "Dad." Then she noticed Claire and immediately smiled with the effortless openness that only children seem able to possess. "Hello. I remember you from the company." Claire smiled back. "I remember you too. Your father talks about you often." Emma laughed softly. "He talks about you too. Mostly computers." Daniel looked slightly embarrassed, causing both Emma and Claire to laugh together. The warmth around the table changed almost instantly. Emma carefully opened the paper bag and removed a drawing mounted on thick construction paper. 3 bright stars floated together above a peaceful night sky, each connected by tiny golden lines. "This is for you," Emma said, handing it to Claire. Claire looked genuinely surprised. "For me?" Emma nodded. "My art teacher said every picture tells a story. I thought maybe yours needed one more happy thing." Claire accepted the drawing with unusual care, tracing the painted stars gently with her fingertips. "They are beautiful," she whispered. Emma pointed proudly at the middle star. "That one shines the brightest because it is not trying to shine by itself. My dad says people are kind of like that." Daniel looked at his daughter with quiet affection. "I think she remembers my lessons better than I do." Claire continued studying the drawing far longer than anyone expected. Something about the simple picture reached a place inside her that expensive gifts and public admiration never had. She realized she could not remember the last time someone had offered her kindness without expecting anything in return. As they prepared to leave, Emma suddenly looked at Claire with innocent curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" Claire nodded gently. "Of course." Emma tilted her head for a moment before speaking. "Why do your eyes look happy when you smile, but sad when you stop?" Claire was unable to answer. Daniel quietly apologized for the unexpected question, but Claire slowly shook her head. "Do not be sorry," she said softly. "Sometimes children notice what adults spend years pretending is invisible." Across town, inside his executive office, Marcus Hale watched security footage showing Claire leaving the cafe while carefully carrying Emma's drawing instead of placing it inside her briefcase. His expression hardened as he realized Daniel Brooks was becoming something far more dangerous than an outside consultant. He was becoming someone Claire trusted. 3 days passed before Claire finally placed Emma's drawing on the corner of her office instead of locking it away inside a drawer. Every morning as sunlight reached through the floor to ceiling windows, the 3 painted stars reflected softly against the polished wood of her desk, quietly reminding her of a conversation that had stayed with her far longer than any board meeting. She found herself looking at the drawing whenever difficult decisions filled her schedule. For reasons she could not fully explain, it made the room feel less empty. Late Thursday afternoon, Claire called Daniel and asked whether he had time for another coffee after he finished work. Daniel agreed, provided they met before he picked Emma up from her community music rehearsal. When Claire arrived at the same neighborhood cafe, Daniel was already waiting with 2 cups of coffee and a small notebook resting beside them. There was no presentation, no contract, and no business proposal waiting on the table. Only quiet conversation. For several minutes, neither of them mentioned the photograph or the misunderstanding inside the operations center. Instead, they spoke about Seattle weather, favorite bookstores, and how quickly children seem to grow. Eventually, Claire looked out the window, where autumn leaves drifted slowly across the sidewalk, before speaking almost to herself. "There is something I have never told anyone outside my family." Daniel remained silent, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Claire folded her hands together. "When I was 16, there was a boy I believed I loved." She smiled faintly at the memory before the smile quietly disappeared. "I thought if he believed I was beautiful, maybe I would finally believe it too." She looked down at the surface of her untouched coffee. "I sent him a picture of myself and asked 6 words that seemed harmless at the time. Do you think I am pretty?" The sounds of the cafe faded into the background as she continued. "He answered with 1 sentence. He said, 'Not really.' Then he showed my picture to several friends. They laughed. It lasted only a few minutes for them, but somehow it lasted 20 years for me." Daniel did not rush to comfort her. He understood that some stories needed room before they could breathe again. Claire continued quietly. "People think I built a technology company because I wanted success. That is only half the truth. I built it because I believed that if I became successful enough, intelligent enough, powerful enough, no one would ever make me feel that small again." A gentle silence settled between them. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Words spoken carelessly can become prisons if we decide to live inside them." Claire slowly lifted her eyes toward him. You make it sound simple. Daniel gently shook his head. It is not simple. It is just possible. Claire looked at Emma's drawing, which she had carefully brought with her inside a protective folder. Do you know why I kept this? She asked. Daniel smiled. Because your office needed another happy thing. Claire laughed softly for the first time in many years without forcing the sound. That is part of it. She carefully touched the drawing with one fingertip. The real reason is because your daughter gave it to me before she knew who I was. She saw a person before she saw a title. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Children usually do. Just then Daniel's phone vibrated with a message from Emma saying that rehearsal had ended 10 minutes early because the music teacher had become ill. Daniel stood immediately. I should go. Claire rose with him and carefully returned the drawing to its folder. As Daniel walked toward the exit, neither of them noticed Marcus Hale sitting quietly inside a parked car across the street. Through the windshield, he watched Claire smiling as she thanked Daniel once more. His eyes narrowed when he realized the greatest weakness inside Whitmore Technologies was no longer hidden inside the company's computer system. It was hidden inside the growing trust between its chief executive officer and the one man he could no longer control. The following Monday began like any other at Whitmore Technologies until quiet whispers started moving through the executive floor faster than official announcements. Employees glanced at their phones, then at one another, before lowering their voices whenever someone walked past. Claire noticed the unusual tension the moment she stepped out of the elevator. Conversations stopped as she approached. Computer screens were minimized. Even Marcus Hale appeared unusually composed, as though he had been expecting the morning to unfold exactly this way. What is happening? Claire asked. Marcus hesitated just long enough to appear reluctant. There is something you should probably see before the board meeting. He handed her a printed email that had been anonymously forwarded throughout the executive offices only minutes earlier. Claire's heart sank before she finished reading the first paragraph. Attached to the message was the same private photograph she had believed no one else had ever seen. Beneath it appeared a short accusation claiming that an outside contractor had copied confidential executive files during the recent network recovery. The contractor's name appeared only once, but that was enough. Daniel Brooks. Claire stared silently at the page while dozens of emotions collided at once. Embarrassment, disappointment, confusion. The memory of Daniel calmly closing the image after only 2 seconds battled against the accusation now sitting in her hands. Marcus spoke carefully. I did not want to believe it either. But he was alone at your computer. He had access. Claire said nothing. Instead, she immediately ordered the security department to contact Daniel and ask him to come to headquarters. Less than an hour later, Daniel entered the same operations center where they had first met. He looked around the room, sensing the change before anyone spoke. The friendly greetings from engineers had disappeared. Curious smiles had been replaced with guarded silence. Claire stood waiting beside the conference table holding the printed email. Someone distributed my photograph throughout the executive offices this morning, she said quietly. Daniel looked at the image only briefly before meeting her eyes again. I'm sorry that happened. Marcus stepped forward. You are not denying involvement? Daniel answered without raising his voice. I am denying that I caused it. Marcus crossed his arms. Then explain how a private file suddenly appears after your visit. Daniel remained calm. By checking the access logs instead of assumptions. Marcus quickly responded. The file was copied during the same week you accessed the recovery system. Daniel nodded once. Then the logs will also show every account that touched it afterward. Claire searched his face for signs of fear, but found only steady confidence. She wanted to believe him, yet the old wound hidden behind that photograph had reopened so suddenly that clear judgment became difficult. After several long seconds, she lowered her eyes. Until we complete an internal investigation, I cannot authorize additional access to our systems. Daniel accepted the decision without argument. He quietly removed his temporary security badge and placed it on the table. That is fair, he replied. But before you finish the investigation, please review the administrator authorization records from the morning of the outage. There is an inconsistency I never had the opportunity to explain. Marcus immediately dismissed the suggestion. We already reviewed everything that mattered. Daniel looked toward Claire instead of Marcus. Pain has a way of making honest people rush toward the first explanation that feels believable. Please do not let it decide for you. Claire could not answer. Daniel simply picked up his worn laptop bag, thanked the receptionist on his way out exactly as he had done every previous visit, and quietly walked through the lobby without looking back. That afternoon, Emma waited outside her school holding the ribbon she had hoped to show her father after class. She immediately noticed his thoughtful expression as he parked beside the curb. "Did something bad happen?" she asked softly. Daniel smiled with gentle reassurance before opening the passenger door. "Something difficult happened," he said. "But difficult and permanent are not the same thing." Emma nodded, believing him completely. Neither of them realized that while they were driving home, one small detail hidden inside the anonymous email had already begun exposing the person who had created the entire deception. The next morning, Claire arrived at Whitmore Technologies, carrying far more than her briefcase. She carried uncertainty, regret, and one question that refused to disappear. Before entering the executive conference room, she stopped beside her office window and looked at the drawing Emma had given her. The three painted stars seemed strangely comforting against the gray Seattle skyline. Then her phone rang. The head of network operations sounded unusually tense. "We have another authentication failure," he said. "Several internal systems are rejecting executive credentials again." Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Activate emergency protocol and isolate the affected servers." Within minutes, engineers filled the operations center once again. Monitors displayed warning messages that looked painfully familiar, although this disruption spread more slowly than the first one. Marcus Hale confidently stepped forward. "We can manage this internally." Claire studied the screens without responding. Something about the timing felt wrong. The investigation into Daniel had barely begun, yet another security incident had appeared almost immediately afterward. She quietly asked the lead engineer to compare the new authentication records with those from the previous outage. The engineer frowned. "There are similarities, but we cannot identify the source." Claire looked at the silent phone resting on the conference table. For several long seconds, she hesitated before making the decision that surprised everyone in the room. She picked it up and called Daniel. When he answered, his voice remained as calm as ever. "Good morning, Claire." She paused before speaking. "We have another network problem." Daniel listened carefully as she described the symptoms. He did not mention the accusation from the previous day. He did not remind her that she had suspended his access. Instead, he quietly asked, "Can someone read me the authentication sequence beginning at line 412? One engineer placed the call on speaker and began reading the encrypted entries exactly as they appeared on the monitor. Daniel interrupted only once. "Please stop there." The room became completely still. "Compare that authorization token with the secondary administrative path I mentioned during my last inspection." Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards. A few seconds later, the lead engineer looked up with visible surprise. "They are identical." Daniel continued speaking with steady patience. "Now compare the creation timestamp of that authorization path with the internal executive login records from the same morning." Another engineer completed the search. His eyes widened. Only one executive account accessed that configuration. Marcus immediately stepped forward. "Administrative accounts are shared during maintenance." Daniel answered calmly. "Not that one. It required a personal security certificate." Claire watched the investigation unfold one careful fact at a time. No raised voices. No accusations. Only evidence. The lead engineer opened another report and quietly read the results aloud. The secondary authorization path had been created from Marcus Hale's executive workstation 3 days before the original outage. A second report confirmed that the anonymous email distributing Claire's private photograph had been transmitted through an automated relay connected to the same administrative certificate before being routed through several internal servers. The room fell silent. Marcus attempted to explain that someone must have compromised his credentials, but another engineer gently interrupted. The certificate was authenticated with your personal hardware security key. That device never left your office. Claire slowly turned toward Marcus, disappointment replacing every trace of anger. She finally understood why Daniel had copied the timestamps instead of defending himself. He had trusted the truth to speak when people were finally willing to listen. Marcus lowered his eyes without another word as corporate compliance officers quietly requested his company identification and escorted him from the executive floor with complete professionalism and respect. No celebration followed. No one applauded. Claire remained standing in the middle of the operations center, surrounded by silent employees who had just watched integrity reveal itself without raising its voice. She looked down at Emma's drawing resting inside the folder she had carried with her all morning, then reached for her phone once again. This time, she was not calling an information technology consultant. She was calling a good man she had failed to trust, hoping it was not too late to ask for forgiveness. 2 weeks later, the grand ballroom of Whitmore Technologies glowed beneath warm crystal chandeliers as employees, community partners, and business leaders gathered for the company's annual appreciation gala. Soft piano music drifted through the room, while conversations blended with quiet laughter. Yet Claire Whitmore stood alone behind the stage curtain, holding a framed drawing of 3 bright stars. It was not the company's newest innovation that occupied her thoughts. It was a simple gift from a little girl who had expected nothing in return. When the evening program began, Claire stepped onto the stage to sustained applause. She thanked her employees for their dedication, recognized the engineers who had restored confidence after difficult weeks, and paused longer than anyone expected before speaking again. "Tonight," she said softly, "I need to correct a mistake that belongs to me." The room became silent. Daniel Brooks, seated near the back beside Emma, looked up with quiet surprise. Claire continued without reading prepared notes. "Several weeks ago, I judged a man before I trusted the truth. I allowed an old wound to become louder than clear evidence. Someone protected my dignity when it would have been easier to protect himself, and I nearly repaid that kindness with doubt." She invited Daniel to join her on the stage. He hesitated only briefly before walking forward, wearing a simple navy suit that reflected the same quiet confidence he had carried into the operations center on the day they first met. Claire turned toward him with genuine gratitude. "Daniel Brooks, thank you for protecting my privacy, for protecting this company, and for reminding me that character cannot be measured by a job title or a bank account." The audience responded with warm applause, but Daniel simply inclined his head modestly. Claire then lifted Emma's framed drawing for everyone to see. "This picture has remained on my desk every day since it was given to me," she said. "It reminded me that people are worth seeing before they are worth judging." Emma smiled shyly from her seat as several guests looked toward her with admiration. Claire took a slow breath before asking the question she had carried inside her heart for 20 years. "Daniel, may I ask you something?" He nodded gently. Her voice became almost a whisper. "Do you think I am pretty?" The ballroom grew completely still. Daniel looked at Claire with kindness rather than surprise. "I think that question has asked too much of your life," he replied softly. "Beauty changes with time. Success rises and falls. Respect can be earned and lost. But a heart that chooses humility after success, forgiveness after disappointment, and truth after fear becomes more beautiful every single day. That is the beauty that lasts." Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment as quiet tears gathered, not from sadness but from relief. The sentence she had allowed to define her for 2 decades finally lost its power. Emma walked onto the stage, carrying a small ribbon from her music class, and gently slipped her hand into her father's before reaching for Claire's other hand. "Now the stars are together," she said with an innocent smile. Laughter mixed with emotion spread across the ballroom. Claire looked down at the little girl, then back at Daniel. "Thank you," she whispered, "not for fixing my computer, for helping me stop believing a lie." Daniel smiled warmly. "You did that yourself. You simply decided the truth deserved another chance." No one hurried to speak after that. Hundreds of people remained quietly standing, Not because they were waiting for another announcement, but because some moments become too meaningful to interrupt. Outside, the Seattle skyline shimmered beneath the evening sky, while inside the ballroom the loudest sound was respectful silence, the kind that arrives only when dignity has been honored, forgiveness has been chosen, and ordinary kindness has quietly changed every heart that witnessed it.